There are questions in life that are not really questions at all. They are mirrors, held up by a stranger at an unexpected moment, forcing you to see a reflection you have been studiously avoiding for years. They are small, polished stones dropped into the placid surface of a pond, and you can only stand and watch as the ripples spread, disrupting everything. For me, that question was posed on a Tuesday evening in a crowded, noisy coffee shop, smelling of burnt espresso and damp wool coats. It was delivered by a former classmate of mine, someone whose name I could barely recall, a friendly face from a past I rarely revisited. She had spotted us huddled over a small table, me nursing a cooling mug of tea, and Julian, my best friend, scrolling intently through something on his phone, his brow furrowed in that specific way it did when a line of code refused to bend to his will. "Leo, oh my God, is that you?" she'd said, her voice bright and sharp enough to cut through the ambient chatter. I had looked up, blinked, and manufactured a smile. We did the usual dance of feigned recognition and vague pleasantries. And then, her eyes had drifted to Julian, who had finally looked up from his phone, a polite but distant curiosity on his face. Her gaze flickered between us, taking in the easy proximity, the way my knee was almost touching his under the ridiculously small table, the way he had, without thinking, reached over and stolen one of my biscuits moments before. She smiled, a knowing, conspiratorial kind of smile. "So, are you two finally dating?" It was such a simple inquiry. Innocent, even. A logical conclusion to draw from the comfortable tableau we presented. But the silence that followed was anything but simple. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and noise from our little corner of the universe. In my own head, 1,000 frantic alarms began to scream. My heart, that traitorous organ, began a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs, a drumbeat for a song of pure terror. I had a reply ready, the one I had perfected over years, a smooth, practiced denial that was light and breezy and left no room for follow-up questions. It was a verbal sleight of hand I had mastered out of necessity. But the words never left my mouth, because I was not the one she was really looking at. Her eyes were on Julian. And Julian was just sitting there. His mouth was slightly parted, as if he were about to speak, but no sound came out. A flicker of something unreadable, surprise, confusion, something else, passed through his eyes. It was a pause that lasted no longer than a single heartbeat, maybe two, an eternity. In that sliver of suspended time, I saw the entire fragile architecture of our friendship laid bare. I saw the unspoken rules, the carefully maintained boundaries, the vast, unspoken territory of my own feelings that I had kept hidden in the deepest vaults of my being. The silence stretched, thin and fragile, and I felt it was about to snap. Then he blinked. He let out a short, quiet laugh that sounded more like a cough, a puff of air that held no real humor. He shook his head. "No, just that. One word." And then, as if to compensate for the hesitation, he added, "No, we're just friends." "Leo's my best friend," he said it with a finality that was meant to be reassuring, a solid wall erected after a moment of strange vulnerability. The woman accepted it with a nod, offered a few more pleasantries, and then disappeared back into the crowd. The ambient noise of the coffee shop rushed back in to fill the void, but for me, the silence remained. It was a different kind of silence now. It was heavy, and it sat between us on the table like a third, unwanted guest. Julian looked back down at his phone, but he wasn't scrolling anymore. His thumb was just resting on the screen, motionless. I stared into my tea, watching the dregs swirl at the bottom of the mug. The pause. It was the pause I couldn't get out of my head. It was too long, far too long for a simple no. And in that pause, a tiny, terrifying seed of hope, a thing I had thought long dead and buried, began to unfurl a single, tentative leaf in the barren soil of my heart. To understand the weight of that pause, you have to understand the foundation upon which it was laid. You have to understand Julian. And you have to understand the decade of my life I had spent learning to love him in silence. We met in college, in a mandatory freshman seminar with a title so convoluted and academic that neither of us could ever remember it. I was a quiet, observant art student, more comfortable with a camera in my hands than with making small talk. My world was one of light and shadow, of composition and framing. I watched people. I learned their rhythms, the subtle tells in their posture, the way emotion could transform a face in a fraction of a second. I was a collector of moments, storing them away in the vast, quiet archive of my mind. Julian was not like that. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of kinetic energy and easy charm, studying computer science with a ferocious intelligence that was both intimidating and deeply attractive. He didn't walk into a room. He arrived, and the room's entire center of gravity would shift to accommodate him. He had a laugh that was loud and genuine, and he used it often. People were drawn to him, orbited him like planets around a sun, and he seemed to bask in their warmth without ever being consumed by it. He was everything I was not, loud where I was quiet, confident where I was hesitant, a statement where I was a question mark. Our friendship shouldn't have worked, by all accounts. We were a study in contrasts, a mismatched pair of socks. But it did. It started with him borrowing my notes, a classic collegiate maneuver, but it quickly evolved into something more. He was fascinated by my photography, by the way I saw the world. He would look at one of my prints, a stark black and white shot of a rain-slicked street or a close-up of a gnarled tree root, and he would see the geometry in it, the underlying code. "It's like you're debugging the world," he'd said once, and it was the most profound compliment I had ever received. In turn, I was mesmerized by the intricate, invisible worlds he built with lines of text on a screen. He would try to explain algorithms to me, his hands moving with an excited energy, and while I rarely understood the mechanics, I understood the passion. I understood the desire to create order from chaos. We became a fixed point in each other's lives. Our friendship was a constant, a reliable anchor in the turbulent sea of our early 20s. It was built on late-night study sessions fueled by cheap pizza, on long, meandering walks across campus where we'd talk about everything and nothing, on a shared, unspoken understanding that we were safe with each other. He was the one person who didn't try to pull me out of my shell, but instead seemed content to simply sit with me inside it. He respected my silence, understood that it wasn't emptiness but a different kind of language. And I found a strange sense of peace in his noise, in the vibrant energy that seemed to radiate from him. It was like standing near a bonfire on a cold night. I could feel the warmth without having to be the one tending the flames. It was during our sophomore year that I realized the nature of my feelings for him had undergone a quiet, seismic shift. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic revelation. It was more like the slow development of a photograph in a darkroom tray, an image gradually emerging from the chemical bath, faint at first, then gaining clarity and definition until it was undeniable. It was in the way my stomach would clench with a strange, pleasant ache when he'd throw an arm around my shoulders in a casual, friendly gesture. It was in the way I'd find myself cataloging the tiny details of his face, the faint scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fall, the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he truly smiled, the exact shade of brown in his hair when the sunlight hit it. These were not the observations of a friend. They were the observations of a devotee. And it terrified me. The friendship we had was too precious, a rare and delicate ecosystem that I couldn't bear to disrupt. To confess my feelings would be to introduce an invasive species, something that could choke out the life of everything we had built. So I made a choice. I would be the quiet observer. I would be the keeper of this secret. I built walls around my heart, high and thick, and I learned to live with the quiet, persistent ache of unspoken affection. I became an expert in the art of platonic intimacy, learning to accept his casual touches without flinching, to meet his gaze without giving away the vast, churning ocean of emotion behind my own. I convinced myself that this was enough, that having him in my life as a friend was infinitely better than not having him at all. He started dating Sarah in our junior year. She was wonderful, bright, funny, kind, and completely, incandescently in love with him. And he, in turn, was in love with her. Watching them together was like watching a perfectly executed piece of choreography. They made sense. It hurt, of course. It hurt in a dull, constant way, like a bruise deep beneath the skin that you only feel when it's pressed. I would see him kiss her goodbye, a quick, easy gesture of affection, and I would have to physically turn away, focusing my camera on some distant object until the sharp sting in my chest subsided. But I was also genuinely happy for him. To see him happy was a balm, even if I was not the source of that happiness. I became the third wheel, the reliable friend, the one they both confided in. I listened to his worries about their future and her frustrations with his work schedule. I was their confidant, their neutral ground. I played my part so well that I think, for a while, I almost managed to convince myself that the role was all I had ever wanted. For years, this was our normal. We graduated. I pursued photography, scraping by with freelance work and gallery showings that barely paid the rent but fed my soul. Julian soared. He took a job with a high-powered tech consulting firm that had him flying all over the country, living out of suitcases and hotel rooms. His relationship with Sarah became a long-distance affair, strained by time zones and missed calls. But our friendship remained. When he was in town, my apartment was his first stop. He'd collapse on my worn-out sofa, complaining about airport security and terrible hotel coffee. And for a few hours, he would just be Julian again, not the high-flying consultant. I was his anchor, the one stable point in his increasingly chaotic life. I'd make him tea, listen to his stories, and for a little while, the ache in my chest would be a familiar, almost comforting presence. It was the price of admission, the cost of keeping him in my life, and I had long ago decided I was willing to pay it. The architecture of my self-deception was sturdy, built over years of careful practice. And then, one rainy October night, the entire structure came crashing down. The catalyst, when it came, was not a dramatic explosion but a slow, painful erosion. Julian and Sarah's relationship had been struggling for a while, a fact I knew from hushed, late-night phone calls from him in sterile hotel rooms and quiet, sad confessions from her over coffee. The distance was a chasm they could no longer shout across. The end was inevitable, a foregone conclusion that everyone could see coming except, perhaps, the two people at the center of it. When the final break happened, it was quiet and civil, which somehow made it even more heartbreaking. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, just a tearful conversation and the mutual, devastating acknowledgement that love was not always enough. He called me from his car, parked somewhere on the side of a highway between his apartment and what was no longer hers. His voice was hollow, a ghost of its usual vibrant timbre. "She's gone, Leo." That was all he said. I didn't need any more details. I could hear the shattering in those 3 words. "Where are you?" I asked, my own voice steady, a practiced calm I did not feel. "I don't know. Just driving. I can't go back to my place. It's too quiet." The quiet. I understood that. The silence in a space that was once filled with another person's presence is the most deafening sound in the world. "Come here," I said. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was a command, a lighthouse beam cutting through his fog. "Just come here." An hour later, he was standing on my doorstep, drenched from the relentless autumn rain, looking smaller and more lost than I had ever seen him. The vibrant energy that always surrounded him was gone, extinguished. He looked like a photograph that had been left out in the sun, all his colors faded to a pale, ghostly gray. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, his eyes wide with a pain so raw and profound that it felt like a physical blow. My own heart cracked in sympathy, but my role in that moment was clear. I was the anchor. I had to hold. I stepped aside and he walked in, dripping water onto my hardwood floors. He walked to the center of my living room and just stood there, his shoulders slumped, his hands hanging limply at his sides. He was a ship adrift, his sails torn, his rudder gone. And in that moment, all the years of carefully constructed walls, all the practiced detachment, it all dissolved. My own secret ache was irrelevant. His pain was the only thing in the room. I walked over to him, and without thinking, without hesitating, I wrapped my arms around him. It was not the first time we had hugged, not by a long shot. But this was different. All our previous hugs had been brief, perfunctory, punctuated by a friendly pat on the back. This was not that. This was me trying to physically hold him together. He was stiff at first, a statue carved from ice. Then a shudder ran through his entire body, a deep, convulsive tremor, and he collapsed against me. His arms came up and circled my back, his hands gripping the fabric of my shirt like a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, and a sound tore out of him, a terrible, ragged sob that was swallowed by the fabric of my collar. And I just held him. I stood there in the middle of my living room, with the sound of the rain lashing against the windows, and held my best friend while he fell apart. I didn't offer platitudes or empty reassurances. There were no words that could fix this. There was only the solid, unyielding pressure of my arms around him, the steady rhythm of my own breathing, the silent promise that he was not alone. He cried for a long time, a storm of grief that had been building for months. I could feel the heat of his tears soaking through my shirt, the trembling of his body against mine. I ran a hand up and down his back in a slow, steady rhythm, the way you would soothe a frightened child. And I focused on the physical sensations to keep my own overwhelming emotions at bay. The damp, cold smell of the rain in his hair, the surprising weight of him leaning against me, the rough texture of his jacket under my palms. It was an act of pure, desperate triage, an attempt to staunch a wound I had no idea how to heal. Eventually, the storm passed. The racking sobs subsided into quiet, hitched breaths. He didn't pull away, though. He just stayed there, his head resting on my shoulder, his body still slumped against mine. The silence that filled the room now was different from the one in the coffee shop. It wasn't tense or awkward. It was heavy with exhaustion and shared sorrow. It was a fragile, sacred space. After a long while, he finally stirred, pulling back just enough to look at me. His face was a wreck. His eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, his cheeks tracked with tears. He looked utterly broken. "Sorry," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I got your shirt all wet." I just shook my head, a small smile touching my lips. "It's just water, Julian. It'll dry." That night marked the beginning of the shift. He didn't go home. He fell asleep on my couch, fully clothed, with a thick quilt I had draped over him. I stayed up for hours, sitting in the armchair across from him, watching him sleep. His face, in the dim light of my reading lamp, was finally peaceful, the lines of stress and grief temporarily erased. And as I watched him, a new, terrifying thought took root in my mind. The space Sarah had occupied in his life was now a gaping void. And in his moment of greatest need, he had come to me. I was the harbor he had sought in the storm. The thought was equal parts comforting and deeply, profoundly unsettling. I had wanted, for so long, to be essential to him. And now, in the worst possible way, I was. I was terrified of what that might mean. The weeks that followed his breakup with Sarah were a blur of careful navigation through the treacherous waters of his grief. My apartment became his default sanctuary, the place he came to escape the echoing silence of his own. This was the genesis of the ritual. It began innocently enough. He'd text me after a long day at work, or when he'd just gotten back from a business trip, a short, simple message. "You home?" It was a question, but we both understood it as a statement of intent. He was coming over. He would arrive, shed his shoes and his professional persona at the door, and collapse onto my couch as if his strings had been cut. He was a marionette at the end of a grueling performance, and my living room was the one place he could finally go limp. At first, we would talk. He would vent about his work, about the suffocating politeness of his clients, about the endless parade of beige hotel rooms. He talked about Sarah, but not in the way I expected. He didn't dissect the relationship or wallow in regret. He spoke of her absence, of the small, mundane habits of coupledom that were now just painful reminders of what he'd lost. The habit of buying groceries for two. The instinct to turn and share a funny thought with someone who wasn't there. He was mourning the ghost of a shared life, and I became the silent priest to his confessions. I would listen, nod, and keep his mug filled with tea, offering the quiet solidarity that had become my trademark. I was careful, so careful, to maintain the role of the supportive friend. My own feelings were locked away, double-bolted in the deepest part of my chest. My primary directive was to be his safe harbor, and harbors do not have their own agendas. The first time he fell asleep on the couch, it was an accident. We had been watching some mindless action movie, the kind he loved and I tolerated, and I'd looked over to see his head had slumped against the armrest, his breathing deep and even. I didn't have the heart to wake him. I simply turned off the television, draped a blanket over him, and went to my own bed, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of thoughts. The second time, a few days later, it felt less like an accident and more like an unspoken arrangement. He'd yawned, stretched, and said, "Mind if I just crash here? I'm too beat to drive." I had mumbled something noncommittal, and that was that. It became the pretext, the plausible deniability we both tacitly agreed to. He was tired. My couch was comfortable. It was just easier. But then, the ritual began to evolve, to escalate in subtle, almost imperceptible increments. It was a slow creep across the carefully drawn lines of our friendship. One night, instead of slumping against the armrest, he slumped against me. We were sitting side by side, watching a documentary I had put on, and his head had gradually, slowly, come to rest on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. Every nerve ending fired at once. I could feel the weight of his head, the warmth of his breath against my neck, the soft texture of his hair against my cheek. I sat there, ramrod straight, for what felt like hours, my own breathing shallow and controlled. I was terrified that if I moved, if I even breathed too deeply, I would shatter the moment. He was asleep, I told myself. It didn't mean anything. It was a simple, unconscious act of seeking comfort, like a plant leaning towards the sun. It had nothing to do with me. But my body didn't believe my brain. My body was humming with a high-frequency current of pure, unadulterated yearning. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his laundry detergent, a scent that was becoming as familiar to me as my own. I could feel the subtle rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. It was an intimacy so profound, so far beyond anything I had allowed myself to hope for, that it was almost painful. It was like being given a glimpse of a promised land I knew I could never enter. I sat there until my own muscles ached with tension, until long after the documentary had ended and the screen had gone black. Only then, with the utmost care, did I gently maneuver him so he was lying down, his head on a cushion instead of my shoulder. My own shoulder felt strangely cold and empty afterwards. The ritual became our new normal. 2 or 3 nights a week, he would end up at my apartment. The pretense of being too tired to drive wore thin, but neither of us ever called it out. It was a comfortable fiction we both maintained. The physical boundary between us continued to dissolve, millimeter by millimeter. One evening, it was chilly in my apartment, and he pulled the quilt not just over himself, but over both of us as we sat on the couch. Our legs were pressed together from hip to ankle under the shared warmth, and I was acutely aware of every single point of contact. My mind, the ever-present photographer, was in overdrive. I was framing these moments, capturing them in high-definition detail. The way the dim light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows across the room. The way his hand, resting on the cushion between us, was so close to my own that I could feel the heat radiating from it. I could have moved my hand, just an inch, and our fingers would have been touching. The thought was so overwhelming, so terrifyingly simple, that I had to clench my own hand into a fist, digging my nails into my palm to ground myself. This became my private torture, my secret pleasure. The anxiety and the yearning were a constant, low-grade fever. I would lie awake in my own bed, listening to the sound of him breathing in the next room, and I would analyze every moment of the evening. What did it mean when his arm brushed against mine? Was it accidental? What did it mean when he smiled at me in that soft, unguarded way when he first walked through the door? Was it just the relief of finding a safe place? Or was it more? I was a detective searching for clues in a case where I was the only suspect. I was poring over evidence that was ambiguous at best, non-existent at worst. It was a form of self-inflicted madness. He started leaving things at my apartment. A toothbrush in a mug by the sink. A worn-out hoodie draped over my armchair. A charging cable snaking out from the wall next to the couch. My space, which had for so long been a solitary sanctuary, was slowly, quietly, becoming a shared territory. His presence was beginning to seep into the very walls, to infuse the air. And I let it happen. Each new object was a small, tangible piece of him, a little anchor holding him here. I was afraid to touch them, afraid to move them, as if they were artifacts in a museum exhibit titled The Life of Julian. One night, the escalation reached a new level. He arrived late, looking more exhausted than I'd ever seen him. A deal had fallen through, a week of sleepless nights and stressful meetings culminating in failure. He didn't even speak when he came in. He just dropped his bag, walked over to the couch where I was reading, and laid down, placing his head directly in my lap without a word of preamble. He curled onto his side, his face turned towards my stomach, and wrapped an arm around my waist. And then he was still. My book slid from my nerveless fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. I couldn't breathe. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my ribcage, beating its wings against my bones. This was This was not ambiguous. This was not accidental. This was a deliberate act. His hair was tickling my chin. His arm was a solid, warm weight around me. I could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing against my thigh. All the air had been sucked out of the universe. Time itself seemed to have stopped. I sat there, frozen, for a long, long time. Every instinct I had screamed at me to do something, but I had no idea what that something was. Should I push him away? Should I run my fingers through his hair? Should I say his name? Any action felt like a monumental choice, a step onto a path from which there was no return. So I did nothing. I simply sat there, a living statue, and let him lie there. Slowly, cautiously, I rested my hand on his back, between his shoulder blades. I felt the muscles there, tight with tension even in his semi-conscious state. Tentatively, I began to rub his back in slow, soothing circles. Under my palm, I felt some of the tension begin to melt away. A soft sigh escaped his lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated comfort. And in that moment, the fear and the anxiety were eclipsed by a wave of something else, something so powerful and overwhelming it almost brought tears to my eyes. It was a feeling of profound, heart-wrenching tenderness. This brilliant, vibrant, capable man, this force of nature, had come to me in his moment of defeat and made himself completely, utterly vulnerable. He had sought not just comfort, but my comfort. He had placed himself in my care. The weight of his trust was more staggering than the weight of his head in my lap. The madness of my internal debate quieted. The endless analysis ceased. There was only this. Him, here, with me. And for the first time, instead of just enduring the intimacy, I allowed myself to sink into it. I leaned my head back against the couch, closed my eyes, and just breathed, my hand never stopping its slow, rhythmic circles on his back. The ritual was no longer just a ritual. It was our language, and I was finally beginning to understand what it was trying to say. The crossing of the line, when it finally happened, was as quiet and unassuming as every step that had led up to it. It occurred on a Sunday night, after a day of comfortable, domestic silence. We hadn't done much of anything. I'd worked in my darkroom, the faint, acidic smell of chemicals clinging to my clothes, while Julian sat at my kitchen table, tapping away at his laptop, the staccato rhythm of his typing a familiar background noise. We had ordered takeout for dinner, eating it straight from the containers while sitting on the floor, our backs against the couch. There was an ease between us now, a new level of domesticity that had settled in over the past few weeks. The anxiety that had once buzzed just beneath my skin had softened into a low, steady hum of nervous anticipation. The question was no longer if something would happen, but when. Later, we found ourselves in our usual positions on the couch, a movie playing on the screen, its light flickering across our faces. He was leaning against me, his head on my shoulder, our legs tangled together under a shared blanket. His hand was resting on my thigh, a casual gesture that had become common, yet still sent a jolt of electricity through my entire system every single time. The movie was nearing its end, the credits about to roll. The air in the room was thick with unspoken things, heavy with the accumulated weight of hundreds of these quiet, intimate moments. I was acutely aware of his breathing, of the faint scent of his shampoo, of the almost imperceptible way his thumb was rubbing a small, slow circle on the denim of my jeans. He stirred, shifting his weight as if to get up. My heart did a familiar, painful clench. This was always the worst part of the ritual, the end. The moment he would disentangle himself from me, murmur a tired goodnight, and retreat to the other side of the room, re-establishing the boundary I had just spent hours watching him dissolve. He lifted his head from my shoulder, and the space he had occupied immediately felt cold. He didn't stand up, though. He just sat there, facing me, his expression unreadable in the dim, flickering light from the television. The silence stretched, and this time it felt different. It wasn't comfortable. It was taut, a wire pulled to its breaking point. He was looking at me, really looking at me, in a way he hadn't before. His gaze wasn't just on me. It was searching, probing, as if he were trying to read the lines of code hidden deep within my own eyes. My breath caught in my throat. I felt exposed, transparent, as if he could see right through the carefully constructed facade and into the chaotic, yearning mess of my heart. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. My own courage, a fickle and unreliable thing, chose that exact moment to make a rare appearance. "What is it, Julian?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, afraid that anything louder would shatter the fragile tension of the moment. He swallowed, his gaze dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before returning to my eyes. That tiny, fleeting movement sent a shockwave through me. It was a signal so clear, so unambiguous, that for a second I thought I had imagined it. "Leo," he began, his own voice as quiet as mine, and just as strained. He paused, and I could see the internal battle playing out on his face. The fear, the hesitation, the want. It was all there, laid bare for the first time. He took a breath, a shaky, uncertain thing. I have to ask you something. And I need you to just be honest. And I need you to know that if you say no, it's okay. It's okay, and we can just forget I ever asked." My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could hear it. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. He leaned in a little closer, and the space between us became charged, electric. His eyes were dark, intense, filled with a vulnerability I had only seen once before, on the night he had shown up drenched in my doorway. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, the words hanging in the air between us like motes of dust in a sunbeam. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The movie, the city outside my window, the blood in my veins, everything just stopped. The question was not a surprise, not really. It was the inevitable conclusion of a long, unspoken conversation we had been having for months. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the plea in his voice, the raw, terrifying vulnerability of it, it was overwhelming. All the years of silent longing, of hopeless pining, of carefully managed friendship, all of it coalesced into this one, singular moment. This was the precipice, and he was asking my permission to jump. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. My voice was gone, lost somewhere in the roaring of the blood in my ears. Instead, I leaned forward, closing the last few inches of space between us. It was my answer, my confession, my surrender. It was me, finally, after all these years, meeting him halfway. His lips met mine, and it was nothing like the passionate, desperate kisses I had sometimes, in my weakest moments, imagined. It was tentative. It was hesitant. It was unbelievably soft. It was a question, not a statement. It was a discovery. His lips were warm and gentle, and for a moment, they just rested against mine, a silent acknowledgement of the monumental line we had just crossed. Then, I felt him relax, a soft sigh of what sounded like relief breathing into my mouth. His hand, which had been resting on my thigh, moved up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking my cheek. The kiss deepened, but it never lost its gentleness, its sense of reverence. It was slow, and it was careful, as if we were handling something infinitely precious and fragile. And in that kiss, I felt the years of unspoken things finally being said. I felt his loneliness, his confusion, his search for comfort that had somehow, miraculously, led him to me. And I hoped, I prayed, that he could feel my response. My patience, my terror, my unwavering, steadfast affection that had been waiting for him all this time. It was a conversation held without a single word, a story told in the quiet language of touch. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He didn't pull away. He just rested his forehead against mine, our eyes closed. His hand was still on my cheek, his thumb still making slow, soothing circles. "Okay," he whispered, the word a soft puff of air against my lips. "Okay." I didn't know what he meant, not exactly. Was he saying it was okay? Was he just processing? But it didn't matter. I just nodded against his forehead, my own hand coming up to cover his. We stayed like that for a long, long time, forehead to forehead, in the flickering light of the television, breathing each other's air. We had crossed the line. We had stepped off the cliff. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the fall. I was only aware of the shocking, terrifying, beautiful fact that he was falling with me. The beautiful, honest silence we had created could not last. In the stark light of morning, doubt and fear are tenacious weeds that can grow in even the most promising soil. The aftermath of the kiss was not the immediate, blissful transition into a new reality that I had naively, foolishly, allowed myself to imagine. Instead, it was a period of unnerving quiet and retreat, a step back that felt, for a few agonizing days, like a full-scale rout. After that night, after that soul-altering kiss and the hours we spent just holding each other on the couch, not sleeping, just being close, he had left in the morning with a haste that set off alarm bells in my chest. He'd muttered something about an early meeting, avoiding my eyes, and was gone before the coffee had even finished brewing, leaving behind a lingering scent of his cologne and a profound, echoing silence. He didn't text that day, or the next. My phone, which had become a constant lifeline to him, a source of little check-ins and mundane observations, remained dark and silent. The silence was a physical presence in my apartment, a cold, heavy fog that seeped into every corner. Every time my phone buzzed with a notification from anyone else, my heart would leap with a painful, desperate hope, only to plummet back to earth. The hoodie he had left on my armchair seemed to mock me. The toothbrush in the mug by the sink felt like an artifact from a lost civilization. I had misinterpreted everything. That's what my mind, my old, reliable fortress of self-protection, began to tell me. The kiss wasn't a confession. It was a moment of weakness, an anomaly born of grief and loneliness. He had sought comfort, and I had been a convenient, willing source. And now, in the clear light of day, he was regretting it. He was horrified by what he had done, by the line he had crossed, and he was running. The pain of this thought was a sharp, physical thing. It was worse than the years of silent pining. The pining had been a dull, manageable ache. This was a fresh, gaping wound. To be given a glimpse of that promised land, to be allowed to take a single step inside, only to have the gate slammed shut in my face, was a cruelty I hadn't prepared for. My anxiety, which had been soothed into a low hum, roared back to life with a vengeance. I paced my apartment like a caged animal. I picked up my camera, hoping to lose myself in my work, but the world outside my lens looked flat and gray, devoid of interest. Every shadow seemed to hold his shape. Every quiet moment was filled with the ghost of his presence. After 3 days of this radio silence, a new feeling began to bubble up through the layers of hurt and anxiety. Anger. It was a slow-burning, righteous anger. Anger at him for his cowardice. Anger at him for leaving me in this agonizing limbo. But mostly, anger at myself for letting him go that morning without a word, for not demanding the conversation we both knew we needed to have. I had been so afraid of scaring him off that I had allowed him to simply disappear, leaving me to drown in the sea of my own insecurities. I had played the part of the patient, understanding friend for so long that I had forgotten how to demand anything for myself. No more. The silence was his weapon of choice, his shield. I couldn't let him hide behind it. Not this time. Too much was at stake. With a resolve that felt foreign but necessary, I grabbed my keys and walked out of my apartment. I didn't call, I didn't text. I just went. The walk to his building was a blur. My mind was a maelstrom of rehearsed speeches and angry accusations, all of which I knew I would probably abandon the moment I saw his face. When I stood before his apartment door, number 4B, my courage almost failed me. My hand hovered over the wood, trembling slightly. This was it. This was the confrontation that could either save us or shatter us for good. I took a deep breath and knocked. The wait was excruciating. For a moment, I thought he wasn't home, or that he wouldn't answer. Then, I heard the sound of the deadbolt turning, and the door opened a crack. He peered out, and when he saw it was me, the flicker of surprise in his eyes was quickly replaced by something that looked like guilt. He looked terrible. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his hair was a mess. He was wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He looked, I realized with a jolt, as miserable as I felt. "Leo," he said, his voice low and rough. He didn't open the door any wider. "Are you going to let me in, Julian?" I asked, my voice firmer than I expected it to be. He hesitated for a second, then sighed in resignation and opened the door. I stepped inside. His apartment was dark, the blinds drawn against the afternoon light. It was tidy, almost sterile, but it felt unlived in. It was a hotel room, not a home. It was the physical manifestation of the loneliness he had described to me. He didn't look at me. He just walked over to his kitchen island and leaned against it, his arms crossed over his chest. A defensive posture. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone flat. "What do you think I'm doing here?" I shot back, the anger finally bubbling over. "You kiss me, Julian." You kiss me like you mean it, and then you vanish. For 3 days. Not a word. Not a single text. What was I supposed to think? He winced, flinching as if my words were physical blows. He still wouldn't look at me. He stared at a spot on the floor, his jaw tight. I'm sorry, he mumbled. Sorry isn't good enough, I said, my voice rising. Talk to me. For once in your life, use your words. Tell me what's going on in your head. Was it a mistake? Is that what this is? Were you just lonely and I was convenient? Because if that's all it was, you owe me the decency of telling me to my face. Finally, he looked up, and the anguish in his eyes stole my breath. It wasn't the look of someone who had made a simple mistake. It was the look of someone who was completely, utterly lost. No, he said, his voice cracking. God, no, Leo. It wasn't a mistake. That's the problem. I stared at him, confused. What are you talking about? How is that the problem? He pushed himself off the counter and started pacing, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. He looked trapped, a panther in a cage too small for its own energy. Because I don't know what it was, he exclaimed, his voice raw with frustration. I wanted to. I wanted to kiss you. More than I've wanted anything in a long time. And when I did, that felt right. It felt more right than anything has felt in years. And that scares the hell out of me, Leo. He stopped pacing and turned to me, his expression desperate. I don't know what this is. I've never felt this way about a guy before. About a friend. I look at you, and for months now, all I've wanted to do is be near you. Your apartment, it's the only place I feel like I can breathe. And I didn't understand why. I told myself it was because of Sarah, because I was lonely. But it's more than that. The night I kissed you, everything just clicked into place, and it was terrifying. It's like I opened a door in my own head, and I have no idea what's on the other side. I don't know who I am anymore. His confession, his fear, his confusion, it was a torrent, and it washed away all of my anger, leaving behind only a deep, aching empathy. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. He was running from a truth so new and disorienting that it threatened to upend his entire understanding of who he was. All the signs I had obsessed over, the small gestures, the lingering touches, they hadn't been a conscious seduction. They had been the unconscious movements of a man drifting towards a shore he didn't even know he was seeking. He was the unknowing initiator, and I had been watching him, documenting his journey without ever realizing he was as lost as I was. I closed the distance between us, stopping just a few feet away. My voice, when I spoke, was gentle again. So you ran, I said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. He nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I panicked. I woke up the next morning in your bed, with your arm around me, and it felt so normal, so right. And I freaked out. I thought, what have I done? I've ruined our friendship. I've dragged Leo into my own mess. I thought you deserved better than my confusion. I thought I had to figure this out on my own before I could face you. You idiot, I said, the words soft with affection. You absolute idiot. Did you ever stop to think that maybe I was already in the mess with you? Did you ever stop to think that maybe you weren't the only one feeling things? His head snapped up, his eyes wide. What? And so, standing there in his dark, sterile apartment, I finally confessed. I told him everything. Not with the same frantic energy he had, but with the quiet, steady cadence of a truth that has been held for a very long time. I told him about the sophomore year revelation, about the years of watching him with Sarah, about the carefully constructed walls I had built around my heart. I told him about the quiet ache, the constant analysis, the terror and the hope that had been warring inside me for months. I laid my own vulnerability bare, offering it up as a mirror to his. As I spoke, I watched his expression change. The confusion and fear slowly receded, replaced by a dawning sense of wonder, of disbelief, and then of profound, overwhelming relief. It was like watching a man who had been lost at sea for weeks finally spot land. When I finished, the silence in the room was no longer heavy or tense. It was light. It was full of possibility. He took a step towards me, then another, until he was standing right in front of me. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently cupped my face, just as he had done after the kiss. All this time, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Leo, all this time. I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. All this time. A single tear escaped his eye and traced a path down his cheek. He didn't seem to notice. He just looked at me, a decade of unspoken history passing between us in a single, silent gaze. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I made you wait." "You didn't know?" I whispered back. "I should have," he said, his thumb stroking my cheek. "I should have known." And then he leaned in and kissed me again. This time, there was no hesitation. There was no uncertainty. It was a kiss of recognition, of homecoming. It was a kiss that said, "I see you. I'm here. I'm not running anymore." It was the end of the conflict and the beginning of everything else. The resolution was not a grand, cinematic crescendo. It was something far quieter, far more profound. It was the slow, deliberate dismantling of old walls and the careful construction of a new foundation, one built on the bedrock of honesty we had finally, painfully, unearthed. After the confrontation in his apartment, after the tears and confessions, we didn't magically have all the answers. Julian's confusion about his own identity didn't just vanish. My years of ingrained self-protection didn't just melt away. But the fear that had kept us apart, the fear of the unspoken, was gone. We had stepped into the light, blinking and uncertain, but we were in it together. We agreed to take it slow, a suggestion that came from him, surprisingly. "I need to get to know this part of myself," he had said, his voice still laced with a hint of wonder. "And I want to get to know you in this way. The right way? Not as an accident or a moment of weakness." His intentionality was a gift, a balm on the wound his withdrawal had caused. And so, we began the process of learning each other anew. The ritual of him coming to my apartment continued, but its purpose was transformed. It was no longer a retreat from loneliness, but a deliberate move towards togetherness. The pretense was gone. He came over because he wanted to be with me. It was that simple and that revolutionary. The couch, once a landscape of agonizing ambiguity, became a place of easy intimacy. When his head rested on my shoulder now, I didn't freeze. I would lean my own head against his, my hand finding his without hesitation. We would sit for hours under our shared blanket, our fingers interlaced, the contact a constant, reassuring current between us. We talked more than ever, not just about the surface-level details of our days, but about the things that truly mattered. He talked about his fear, about the process of recalibrating his own self-image. He admitted that the question in the coffee shop had been the first crack in his denial, a moment where the outside world had reflected back an image of himself he hadn't been ready to see, but couldn't ignore. The pause, he confessed, was his brain short-circuiting, trying to reconcile the easy no he thought he should say with the confusing yes he suddenly felt. I, in turn, learned to be open with my own affection. It was like learning a new language after a lifetime of speaking only in whispers. I learned to say, "I missed you," when he came back from a trip. I learned to reach for his hand when we walked down the street. I learned to take photographs of him, not as a secret observer, but openly. My favorite was a shot I took one afternoon as he sat on my floor, bathed in the warm, late-day sun streaming through the window, reading one of my photography books. He was completely absorbed, a small, peaceful smile on his face. In that picture, I captured not the whirlwind of energy the world saw, but the quiet, contemplative soul I had fallen in love with. I had finally framed him not as an object of distant yearning, but as a part of my world, a part of my home. The physical boundaries continued to dissolve, but now with a sense of joyous, mutual discovery. Kisses were no longer confined to a single, climactic moment. They became a part of our new language. A soft kiss on the forehead when he was stressed about work. A quick, stolen kiss in the kitchen while waiting for the kettle to boil. Long, slow kisses on the couch at the end of the day that spoke of comfort and passion in equal measure. One night, as he was about to retreat to the couch, I stopped him. I took his hand and simply said, "Stay." It was all that was needed. He followed me to my bedroom, and for the first time, he didn't sleep on the couch. He slept in my bed, curled around me, his arm draped protectively over my waist. Lying there in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing right beside my ear, I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. The empty space beside me, a space I had been so accustomed to that I had stopped noticing its ache, was finally, blessedly full. Our new normal was made up of these small, quiet moments. It was me waking up to the smell of coffee because he was an early riser, and had learned exactly how I liked it. It was him coming home to my apartment, and he had started calling it home without thinking, to find I had saved him dinner. It was the easy back and forth of domestic life, the sharing of space and time and self. His things were no longer just visiting my apartment. They were moving in. His favorite mug found a permanent home in my cupboard. His books started to fill the empty spaces on my shelves. My solitary sanctuary had become our shared haven. The door that had once been left tentatively ajar was now wide open, and we were both building a life inside. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. A question in a coffee shop, a rainy night, a shared blanket on a couch. They are the quiet hinges on which your entire world can turn. For years, I had believed that my love for Julian was a story destined to be written only in my own mind, a silent film that no one else would ever see. I had resigned myself to being the observer, the keeper of secrets, the safe harbor he would visit but never stay in. But I was wrong. The pause that had once filled me with such terror and hope had been a beginning, not an ending. It was the moment the earth shifted beneath our feet, forcing us both to look down and finally see the ground we were truly standing on. We had been speaking different languages, he with his unconscious actions and I with my silent observations, but we had been telling the same story all along. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we'd learned to create together, a silence that was no longer about things left unsaid, but about everything that no longer needed to be. It was the quiet peace of finding a home in another person, and the breathtaking realization that they had been building a home for you all along.